you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm gonna get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's gonna happen to you?
What?
You're gonna have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to an episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Jay is the proprietor of Jay's Analysis, and he is also the author of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, a very important book that I urge everyone to get out, buy, and read. He's also the host of Hollywood Decoded. Jay, I actually had the opportunity to watch one of those episodes recently. I was really taken by it. It was fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad we got to put in, you said you watched the Chinatown episode. I'm glad we got to deal with everything from film noir to the occult and Man Ray and Black Dahlia to Laurel Canyon and Dave McGowan in that episode.
Yeah, it's two Jays, Jay Widener and Jay Dyer, of course, sitting in two chairs talking about these movies, interspersed with clips and these things. So it's really well produced. Your particular take on Chinatown was interesting. It's this whole idea of the corrupt origins of Los Angeles with Mulholland and the water wars feeding into the growth of the motion picture industry, which has played such a significant role in shaping the American identity. I thought that was an interesting take on that.
Yeah, that's mentioned at the beginning of L.A. Confidential, for example, that the rise of Hollywood was itself, in many ways, a prepackaged ideology to try to sell people on the American dream, which echoes some of what maybe John Adams has talked about before.
And also this idea, what I think is always interesting is that some of these study or focusing on a particular city like Los Angeles or Las Vegas or even Disneyland, a fake city. It tells us so much about what's really going on in the world. If you look at the intrigues, behind the neon lights and the glitch, you have all the crime, the murder involved in building
the mob, right?
Yeah, and the intersection of gangsters, politicians, celebrity entertainers, and these things. So they're all like one. I wouldn't say one syndicate, but they all interact with each other to produce Americana. The way it's very
well. You need to look no further than the fact that Las Vegas has a giant former post office building that's now a museum dedicated to the mobsters.
So yeah, it's gone popular culture. It's
it is.
Well, it's the same way they have a museum in D.C. dedicated towards spy intelligence and
yes,
and
I've been
very close.
They're very telling.
So they're very close. So yeah, so I urge anyone to go out and catch those shows. The Gaia Network, and it's really a fascinating show. They vary in time. This one was like 45 minutes, if I recall.
I think the Chinatown was 30.
No, it was closer to 30. You're right. It was because it was.
I think the Matrix one might have been 40, 45, but yeah, they're always 45 to 30 minutes.
So that's Hollywood Decoded.
Yeah, we have 23 episodes finished. I think six have aired, and yeah, I don't actually know what the price of Gaia is, but it's not a whole lot. But they're all kind of in the same vein. So yeah, if you like the podcast that I've done before, analyzing film, they're kind of in that same vein. A lot of the same stuff from the book, but Jay Widener also comes with a lot of encyclopedic Hollywood knowledge that I don't have. So we kind of complement one another in that process of discussing it. So it's what Siskel and Ebert should be, I say.
It's a esoteric Siskel and Ebert.
Yeah.
So tonight, well, you've started I guess I wouldn't call it a series, but a certain, I guess, you're focusing on globalist books, revelatory books,
right.
And fairly recently, you did this addendum to Tragedy and Hope, the Anglo-American Establishment, and you followed up with Game of Nations by Miles Copeland.
Right.
And then you also had an interview, or you did an episode where you talked about Dugin, this Russian philosopher, this fourth-wave political theory, which some could say is sort of a reaction to the Anglosphere globalism, which I thought it might. We talked about these three tonight. It did blend well in a coherent conversation. So,
sure.
How do you want to start? Do you want to start with Quigley?
Yeah. So this is, as you said, just the addendum to Tragedy and Hope. As I understand, it was published later. Probably not. The copy that I have has the copyright as 1981. So he focuses on the characters that are mentioned as the big name players in Tragedy and Hope, which are, of course, the same as the Milner Group, a.k.a. the Cliveden Set, a.k.a. the Chatham House Group, a.k.a. the Royal Society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all pretty much the same group. Quigley says that. He says they're all the same. They're just different names for the same people. Royal Institute for International Affairs, it's all the same group. And they're the people who set up the League of Nations, and they're also the people who set up the subsequent United Nations. So what you have is the explanation for obviously the two world wars and the global institutions that they produced. You have the explanation for why the CFR was able to transition the United States out of its isolationist, quote-unquote, perspective and into a globalist engine for the Pax Americana. And you have the explanation for why the Pax Americana superseded the Pax Britannia. And ultimately, this goes into the ideology of the characters in the circles of Milner, Rhodes, et cetera, et cetera. So these are people who basically work with Lord Rothschild, with the Rothschilds, absolutely 100%. It is a secret society. They have circles and front groups, just like most people think of secret societies having. And most people, I'm sure, who listen to you are probably familiar with the Rhodes Roundtable groups and all that, and how the Chatham House and CFR are kind of the extensions of that. So I'm not going to bore everybody with that kind of stuff. But it is interesting that it's a Jesuit-based model for this secret society, according to Quigley.
So Jesuits do run the world?
No. This group is super Jesuit. They don't care about any religious ideology, except for, oddly enough, some of the members, according to Quigley, believe that Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy's cult, would possibly be the coming New Age, New World religion. Apparently some of them did think that. And he makes it sound like some of them actually believed it. They actually thought that you could, through mesmerism, mind powers, this was kind of popular in that time period, you could heal yourself. But no, it's rather that it's patterned on the organizational structure of the Jesuits. It is not the Jesuits. However,
that's similar to like the Illuminati with Weishaupt, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so like a lot of people look at Weishaupt, I've heard him referred to as a Jesuit. He was Jesuit trained. He wasn't a Jesuit.
Correct.
Yeah.
But what I believe happens is that the plan of this group, which is that England would eventually supplant the power of the Roman Catholic Church, eventually was successful, not necessarily through the power of the British Empire, which is what they wanted back in the days of Cecil Rhodes, but eventually through the capture of the engine of America.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of Cecil Rhodes's key plans, was to bring back the colonies.
The great rapprochement, I guess you could say, yeah.
Yeah. Now, this was structured in the sense of you had Cecil Rhodes, Lord Rothschild, kind of running the inner circle there. Lord Rothschild was the trustee of the fortune, and then you had a junta of the three. Well, he says the Rhodes and Rothschild at the top. Then you have Stead, Brett, and Milner, and then you had a circle of initiates around them, namely Cardinal Manning, General Booth, yes, of the Salvation Army, Lord Grey, and Lord Balfour. So this is where you get the creation of the State of Israel. Lord Rothschild, of course, played a key role in this. He Quigley explains on pages 39 to 40. And then you have a whole bunch of outer circle people. I believe he says a couple thousand that would be involved in the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And so this is essentially all done through Eton and Cambridge and Oxford. This is the three schools, mainly from Eton and Oxford is where the people are recruited into this. And in the early stages, as we said, it was recruitment into the ideals of the British Empire. And so the idea was just kind of, look, this is the best model for running the world. It's what produces a civilized society. It's what raises the third world savages and barbarians out of their misery. It's just the natural order of things.
It's the white man's burden, right?
Yes, this is the age of the Darwinian origin of species, which has the Anglo-Saxon, of course, at the pinnacle of the evolutionary process, the favored race among mankind. And I should add that I don't think that it's accidental that this is the ideology that develops in England after the Reformation and their apostasy. So you have at the time, of course, of Henry VIII, right, the creation of the Anglican Church with the king as the head. And it's very well documented. It's not even, I don't think, controversial. I wrote back in my grad days several papers on the occultic and Gnostic influences of the British Empire, and particularly into the characters of courtly figures like Edmund Spencer, Ben Jonson, John Donne. All these people are really into Hermeticism and alchemy. And the only reason I bring all that up is that the mythos of the British Empire is a kind of Gnostic mystical imperialism. This is detailed in the book by Gould and Fitzgerald, Mystical Imperialism, right? Invisible Empire about Afghanistan. So one can debate whether, to what degree they really believed in these ideologies or whether it was just an imperial myth. I think that some of these people really do believe their own propaganda. Some of these people, again, this is because, for example, Darwinism, which is, again, a creation of the Royal Society and British imperialism, Darwinism is not a scientific theory. It is actually a philosophy, as many critics who are scientists have actually pointed out. By its very nature, the claims of Darwinism are grand narratives about man's origins, especially in the Victorian period. It included a lot of presuppositions about man's future orientation and, quote, progress. But the scientific nature, by definition, which is a tool of investigating the natural world, that cannot in itself tell you any kind of qualitative value judgment about man being lesser in the past and greater evolved in the future. By definition, it can't do that. That's like saying, that it's like it's a tool for investigating the natural world, and a tool doesn't give you an explanation or a grand answer to things. If you can stare at a hammer all day long and it doesn't tell you about man's origins, and it doesn't tell you about where man's going in the future. It's a hammer. It's a tool. So in the same way, the scientific method is that. But I think that the British imperial characters, and the more that I read them, Russell, Huxley, Charles Galton, Darwin, who I've also been reading his book, The Next Million Years, Bertrand Russell, etc. The more that you read these guys, the more you see that they are very invested in this myth. And they're very adept at propaganda. And they are the propagandist for the guys that I'm telling you about. They're the propagandists for the inner circle of the Milner, the Rhodes, the Rothschilds, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the real Illuminati. You could say, well, what about Jewish power and influence? Well, there's an interesting section in Quigley's book about the partitioning of Palestine. And Quigley is very candid about the various characters in the Royal Society and in the Milner Group, the Clivian set, etc., who they really didn't care either way. They didn't like Zionism or Judaism any more than they liked Arabs or disliked Arabs. Some of them had an affinity for Arab culture. Some of them might have been more Judaic in their interests, maybe through intermarriage. But he argues in the Zionism chapter that there really wasn't a, quote, racial motivation in the partitioning of Israel, but that rather it was pretty much imperial politics, and that it was a chess piece. It was a geostrategic location, much in the same way as Miles Copeland will describe Egypt as a geostrategic location. The U.S. empire has no, at least in Miles Copeland's day, didn't really care about Nasserism versus Islam versus Zionism. He's now both authors, Copeland and Quigley, will say that the Western powers had adopted a general pro-Israel tendency precisely because they wanted a partitioned Palestinian state. But it's also kind of left, and you're also given the impression that they kind of like there being this partitioned Palestine-Israel state, because this allows a dialectical conflict in the region to continue. So I think they wanted that. They want it to continue. And I think that's kind of a distraction that people get wrapped up in, obsessing over some side of some conflict, 2,000, 3,000 miles away that doesn't have anything to do with their daily lives. I often get criticized by people who are very interested in the Palestinian cause because I don't speak up for the Palestinian cause or something like that. And that's because I don't really know any Palestinians. I've never been to Israel. I don't know about the lay of the land, but I do know that according to Carroll Quigley, this was a designed conflict by the Round Table Group. So that much I do know. Anyway, so I found the Zionism chapter very enlightening. But there's all kinds of facts. I mean, you can really go on and on and on. You've got another interesting fact that Quigley points out is that they controlled the major organs of publishing and media, BBC and the Ministry of Information, from the 20s and 30s on. So this group had complete control of almost the entirety of British media from the 1920s. He also says that in the United States, their colleagues in the conspiracy, and he explicitly mentions all the characters, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, they also completely had control of the major press organs in the U.S. in the 20s. So the New York Times, according to Quigley, has been printing the propaganda of this group since the 20s and 30s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a speech in 1917 by Oscar Galloway, the senator? Oscar Calloway, 1917, talking about how the Morgan interest bought up a couple dozen newspapers, and they do, I think you've said this, the way they do this is they just, fire the editor, install their own editor, and they can control the press, because the rest of the newspapers in the country would rely on these 24 newspapers for the news. So it's a fairly simple method of controlling information.
Yeah, he talks about the very same process of they would go to different news outlets and they would just say, print what we want or we'll just buy you.
Yeah. And when you're the money power, you can do that.
Right.
Yeah. And we see that today in today's mainstream media, the concentration in today's media is a function of that. But that started long ago. Mass media itself, I've said this before, I think it was always, from the get-go, was developed for mass manipulation. It's a powerful tool, and you'd be naive to think it won't be used for such things. It gets more refined and more powerful as the technology improves, I guess. Radio to TV to, but they just buy up the newspapers. I was reading, it was the Cultural Cold War by Frances Stoner Saunders, and she's talking about what's his name? Guy? Oh, Bradley. Well, not Bradley. What was his name? Guy who did on the CNN show, Pat Buchanan. He was the liberal.
Oh, I know. I mean, I'm familiar with that, but I didn't watch that back then.
He worked for the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and was reading at the end. He left the CIA, and Nelson Rockefeller bought him a newspaper.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's like, okay, that's how it's done, huh? It's like, Nelson Rockefeller would just buy people newspapers,
Well, I'd like to mention too that I titled my my talk originally "The Liberal World Order" because that is accurate. It is the liberal Imperium, and the reason they call it that is because this is pages 125 to 133 or 4 is that they see the older models of nation states. That's done with. That's dead. They don't want that. They also don't want the idea of imperialism. Imperialism was not palatable. It had gotten too many bad marks in terms of how it's viewed and left a bad taste in people's mouths. So they decided to come up with a rebranded framework based on the British imperial model of the Commonwealth, but they would just call it the Commonwealth of Democratic States, the Commonwealth of God, the liberal Commonwealth. They use all these different terms. It would be based around the idea of freedom, around the ideas of liberal capitalism. There was a lot of debate over this topic in different phases in the decades of the Royal Society, according to Quigley, where for a while they favored sound currency, gold standard, these kinds of things. Then they later shifted away from that to different models of, he says, eventually monopoly capitalism.
There's all like phases. No principle here. It's all phases.
Exactly.
Very pragmatic.
Exactly. Another amazing, bizarre statement was, I believe this is Lionel Curtis, or let's see. Yeah, Curtis. This is, I think, sums it all up. This is under his idea of the Commonwealth. Curtis says the idea that the principle of the Commonwealth implies universal suffrage betrays the ignorance of its real nature. So he's saying, no, don't mistake us for merely saying that we're here to give everybody voting rights. We mean much more than that. That principle simply means that the government rests on the duty of the citizens to one another. In another work, he explains, as sure as day follows the night, the time will come when the dominions will have to assume the burden of their whole affairs. For men who are fit for it, self-government is a question not of privilege but of obligation. It is a duty, not an interest, which impels men to freedom, to duty, and not interest. It is the factor which turns the scale in human affairs. India is included in this same evolutionary process. A despotic government might long have closed India to Western ideals, but the Commonwealth is a living, evolving thing. It cannot suffer any part of it to remain inert. To live is to move in every limb. Under British rule, Western ideals will continue to penetrate and to disturb all of Oriental society. And whether the new spirit ends in anarchy or leads to the establishment of higher order depends upon how far the millions of Indians can be raised to a fuller and more rational conception of the ultimate foundations upon which the duty of obedience to the government rests. So what Curtis is saying is that we don't know even where this is going. I mean, ultimately they do, but he's saying that the evolutionary process of democracy is such that, just like evolution, it's a principle of freedom, that it will disturb and destroy all of the despotism, quote unquote, of the East. In other words, our ideology will be a virus to wreck all the existing orders of other countries. And it's interesting because when we get to Dugin, you'll find the exact same statement made by Pentagon Army strategist Stephen Mann when he says explicitly that democracy is a virus to destroy other cultures.
Yeah, and Curtis there is enshrouding in language that we superficially might find appealing.
Yeah, it sounds flowery and nice.
Yeah, because you want to uplift. Obviously, the West, I think, did have something to offer the world in terms of technology and, I believe, a better philosophy. But that's just a cover for going in and smashing these cultures and exploiting them. I mean, that's. Mm-hmm. I mean, look what they did to India or Ireland for that. Of course, Ireland's part of the West, but if you look at the Bengal famine in 1943 under British rule. It wasn't always the case, was it? Where they were going in and civilizing these, uplifting them and introducing them into modern technology and education and enlightening this benighted world. That's just the cover for these things.
I think that, I mean, you can look at previous empires which actually did and have raised the living standards and improved people's lives. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Orthodox Byzantine Imperium, I think, has a lot of positive aspects to it. Even prior to that, before the establishment of the Eastern Imperium, you could look at Rome. You could look at, there are positive sides to these things, but I think what's unique and what's different is that you have a completely new ideology once there's the rise of usury, international banking. You know, this is what happens in the West as a result of various theological changes. This is detailed in Michael Hoffman's new book, The Occult Renaissance of Rome, where he details the Roman acceptance of usury. Yeah, as a result of Renaissance influence. So you're absolutely right that there are good things in the, quote, West, but what it is exactly to be the West is also somewhat ambiguous because, for example, you know, would we consider, since the Pope sent Cyril and Methodius to Christianize Russia, I mean, is Russia West or is it East? So, you know, many people have, in terms of ideology, classed Russian Orthodoxy and Russian civilization as part of the West.
Yes.
China, well, obviously that's not West, that's Far East. But so it's just kind of difficult to. I'm not accusing you of that. I'm just saying that we've, to make it very simple here, as we pointed out when we did our Quigley talks. Quigley says that what the 20th century had the effect of doing was removing the idea of an imperial authority, be it the Holy Roman Empire, or Russian Orthodoxy, or the Orthodox Imperium, which is what you see in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. The first 7/8 ecumenical councils are all called by the emperor. Mm-hmm. That's all been destroyed post Constantinople falling to Islam, post, exportation of Bolshevism, et cetera, to Russia. So that's been wiped out. The German threat has been wiped out. Russia has been wiped out. What you have is just the dominance of what Lionel Curtis is talking about, which is the force of liberalism. And again, we mean here classical liberalism from Smith, Ricardo, John Locke, Jefferson, these characters.
Yeah, the Newtonian world where it's I think it's been described. It's all inertia and gravity, and there's no philosophy, no teleological meaning to the universe. And,
exactly.
And in that universe, you can justify anything, and they have.
It's just an exchange of units and energy is just the exchange of matter from one state to another state. Mm-hmm. Right? The movement of matter movement of atoms and molecules from one place to another place. That characterizes everything. Therefore, the entirety of reality and life is nothing but monetary transaction, because monetary transaction is just transactions that symbolize the movement of units from one place to another. Because ultimately there's no purpose beyond the phenomena themselves. And that's absolutely why I've always been completely opposed to Newtonian atomism, but you're never told. I was just reading Bertrand Russell's Scientific Outlook, and he cites the three heroes of modern, quote, scientism. You would think that there's nothing else going on in the world except for Galileo, Newton, and Darwin. These are the only three characters that matter. Of course, I guess Marx matters a little bit later on. Explicitly matters to Russell and H.G. Wells, who are big fans of Karl Marx. But yeah, you're not told. What about Newton's Hermeticism? Newton is obsessed with alchemy. I believe it's in Tel Aviv, where all of Newton's alchemical writings are stored in Jerusalem. So Newton was not this pioneer of rational materialistic scientism. He was this bizarre weirdo occultist. And so his philosophy of atomism is 100% occultic gobbledygook.
And that, of course, that informs the development of finance. The alchemy of alchemy of banking, the alchemy of finance. How it's further and further removed away from any economic reality.
Yes,
and the money itself is used as a tool of extraction and exploitation. The money that they make us all use at the point of a gun, because you have, currency laws, that make us accept it. There are all types of policies. Military policies enthroned the dollar as a world reserve currency, and that leads to all sorts of exploitation, which is hard to take notice of or to recognize, from the standpoint of the everyday consumer, or common man. The petrodollar, these things, and how this exploits labor, and this gets into usury and the rationalization of exploiting cheap labor, how that leads to the deindustrialization of the United States and the exploitation of cheap labor. Cheap labor that is provided by these various wars of destabilization and civil war that the British and American intelligence agencies foment constantly around the world, for the benefit of Standard Oil, or United Fruit, or Nike.
No, it's for the benefit of the free peoples of all races, tribes, cultures, and societies. And
if you point this out, people call you a communist.
Yes, I've had such a long, hard, upward battle with, for example, family members trying to explain this for a long, long, long time.
Corporations are not free market. Corporate personhood is not a free market concept. That's a legal fiction dreamt up by some judges.
Right, but I think that where we may disagree is the fact that the free market came about as a means to move into the phase of an older form of internationalism.
It can't exist.
Say what?
The free market cannot exist. I don't think it can exist in this ideal state. It's like...
what I'm saying is that the characters who were first arguing for it at the time of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, all that, they were working at the behest of certain interests that wanted to replace the older ideas of how societies were organized.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it was a time maybe 10, 15 years ago that I would have looked at the enclosure movement as necessary, because you spurred industrial development and increased efficiency in agriculture and these things. But really, if you look at the true history of the enclosure movement and the disruption that it posed, it also coincided with with the English Reformation and the looting of church property. And the church property itself was a way of life in England. It provided stability in these things. And the notion of economic progress being the only measure of value is in itself is a philosophical corruption.
Well, everybody gets mad at me when I talk about this, but if you watch Downton Abbey, this is detailed in the series. And I'm not saying that the British aristocracy are good by this. I'm just saying that it's an example of how the series was actually chronicling the loss of community and the loss of the older conceptions of the nobility. Mm-hmm. And so in that series, you have Lord, I forget what his name is, but he's kind of like the centerpiece of the local village. And they donate, property, they donate this and that, and they own lands, and they're still kind of the feudal people who are the farmers and this kind of stuff. And it's in the transition period where they're moving into industrialization and large scale capitalism. And what happens is the whole village in the series by the teens and the 20s kind of gets reorganized, and it's reorganized by big corporate interests, big conglomerates, the cartels. Quigley details these, the rise of these figures that displace the older aristocracy and the older notions of how society was organized. So the point is not that the Lord Grantham and his older order were the best or the greatest. The point is that they eventually are superseded by, there's a great scene where the guy comes in and Lord Grantham has given the servants Christmas off. They have like a week off or something like that. And the capitalist guy who owns some big, I don't know, news company or factory or something, he's sitting there and he's talking to Lord Grantham, and he says, "Oh, I brought my servants with me." And Lord Grantham says, "You haven't given them Christmas off?" And he says, he looks at him and he says, "What are you, a weakling?" He's like, you're a wuss. Only a wuss would give the servants Christmas off. So in other words, he's like another level of viper. The industrialist doesn't even want the servants to have the right of Christmas off. It's unbelievable.
It's not efficient.
Exactly. That's his whole point. He's like, don't you want to, if you're going to compete in the modern world, you've got to be efficient. And so anyway, I digressed off into that one.
Yeah, it's cold. It's cold. It's almost like these corporations have no sense of noblesse oblige, whereas this. And like you said, the old order wasn't perfect, but what's replacing it? And the ideology of liberty and economic freedom and free trade is being used as a solvent or a trick to get people to accept this new order. But in the final analysis, are people better off? And
well, see, that's the thing. What's interesting about that series is also all of these other ideas that are concurrent with the rise of the industrialists. Another big theme in the story is feminism, suffrage, women's rights, and all this. Mm-hmm. And 3 or 4 of almost all of his daughters fall for it. Mm-hmm. They're all into the suffrage and the feminism, and one of them marries a young guy who's a radical RIA. He's like a Republican, Irish Republican guy, mm-hmm. socialist. And then when he's first introduced to the family, he's a very radical guy who wants the Bolsheviks to succeed. So then when they start bringing in the white emigres who had to flee the Bolsheviks to defeat them, he kind of changes his tune, and he realizes that the idealistic socialist revolution that he hoped for actually just led to millions of people dying. The daughters begin to realize that the suffrage and feminism that they were getting into was really part and parcel of the destruction of their whole lifestyle and community that they had known for centuries. And that's what's so tragic about the series, is that they were being sold these ideas through the big monopoly capitalists, and unfortunately through these very figures that we're talking about, the Lionel Curtises and the Inner Royal Society clique, who had already adopted the world technocratic socialism that we're discussing. And there's these scenes where Lord Grantham can't understand why this is happening to England, and I think that if you could, I understand he's a fictional character, but if you could transplant him to go speak to Lord Curtis or one of these other characters, he would be told, well, we don't care about England. And that's exactly what Lionel Curtis says. He says, don't think that any of this has anything to do with the English people. We could care less about the English people. And that's what I think a lot of the people couldn't fathom. They couldn't fathom that there would be an international clique that had absolutely no concern and, in fact, a complete hatred for England. And that would include the other nobility.
Yes, yeah. And you could gather that from the Battle of the Somme.
From what?
The Battle of the Somme. World War One. When 100,000 British soldiers were killed in 2 afternoons. They had no concern for British skin. They had no problem dumping them into the trenches and having them go over the top into automatic weapon fire.
Right. And now, I understand that persons could probably find individuals throughout history where you find tyrants and kings and lords who had no concern for their subjects or their soldiers. But I think the point is that you have in this case something unique in that you have the adoption by a certain clique of very powerful, wealthy people of a completely psychopathic ideology. I mean, this is different from...
Is it reptilian?
In many ways, yeah. Yes. This is different from a tyrant. This is different from a guy who's, a boss hog or whatever. This is a clique of internationalists who are committed to a scientific technocracy. Yeah. Even back then. Mm-hmm. And they're internationalists.
Their obsession with cybernetics, these things, And,
well, Wells in The Open Conspiracy says that that all the nation states are eventually going to have to die away, and you're just going to have to accept it. And he says a lot of people are going to die not wanting to accept the end of the nation state, but they'll just have to die. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. And there's the ideology of universal suffrage. I mean, you give women this thing called the vote, give them a few cigarettes, and and that's it. That's liberty.
Well, what's funny is that it's the guys of the Royal Society who are saying we're going to give universal suffrage. Does anybody actually think that the votes of the masses influenced in any way the Royal Society?
No,
of course not.
No.
So the irony is that you can basically deduce. Quigley actually says that voting is essentially worthless, and there haven't been real candidates in what is probably a century at least.
Well, when he was still alive, before he was uploaded to the higher consciousness, David Rockefeller, I heard it phrased this way: if you believe in democracy, you think that your vote is as important as David Rockefeller's.
Exactly.
It's a dollar. We have democracy called dollar democracy, meaning the more wealth you have, the more power you have. That's even the wealthy are powerless in the final analysis. We're talking about the oligarchs.
Right.
Who don't count their money in terms of dollars because that's in itself is part of the scam, the currencies. But they control resource. In fact, the thing about the families like Rockefellers is they've actually mastered the ability to control things without owning them, so they don't have to pay any taxes.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they the foundations, right?
Right.
The World Wildlife Federation.
Mm-hmm.
These things, how they're conservation, Agenda 21, these things. That's how they operate. That's what's his name? The Canadian who Rockefeller promoted.
Maurice Strong.
Yeah, Maurice Strong. He's a great example of one of these guys.
Sure.
Do conservation, taking over water, and they target really physical resources. They're big into like extraction and property and land. They own lots of land. And
this is why people fall for FDR. FDR was just a tool, a stooge for these kind of guys. Mm-hmm. Public works projects. We talked about this in Quigley. There's a whole chapter where,
and you talked about it in Hollywood Decoded, right? That's a part of that big scam.
Yes, the Chinatown episode, which is the public works projects of L.A. Ultimately, were a scam for privatization.
Yeah, they get the taxpayers to pay for it, then it's
yeah. Exactly.
And even today, you're talking with like the World Bank, will finance development, supposedly to help everybody. Of course, like you said, like the tower in Cairo, where maybe some money was devoted to it, but I'm sure 90% of it was was stolen, just like the money at the Pentagon was stolen.
Oh, yeah, it went into Nasser's pocket.
Yeah, Nasser's pocket and other people. It's in Swiss bank accounts. But one thing it does do is it does pay for infrastructure development, paid for by the taxpayers of the world, and then the oil companies or international corporations come in and use that infrastructure instead of building it themselves.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Socializing. It's the same way they do with the intelligence agencies. If you want to boil it down, the function of the various intelligence agencies, whether it's Mossad, CIA, or British intelligence, it's a way to socialize risk and privatize profit.
Privatize profit. Yep.
Same with the Pentagon, right? I mean, it's, I don't think you don't have to be a leftist hippie to say the Pentagon works for corporate interest. I mean, come on. I mean, it's.
I think anybody with common sense should be able to figure that out. You know?
I mean, the F-35 fighter. Well, I guess it's Lockheed that's making that. If you own stock in that, then that's a good program for you.
Yeah, and I think that people miss this when it comes to something like North Korea. North Korea, a lot of money is made over North Korea. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be a real war. There's not a real threat there. But this news gibberish that goes on every year with this stuff is directly related to defense contracting and the purchasing of weapons.
Yes.
And it's done because people are convinced by the ridiculous B movie that the mainstream media plays in relationship to the nuke threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then Congress says, "Oh, well, we got a threat. We got to purchase some new ABM technology, and we'll contract that out to Raytheon or whoever."
We better build a 14th aircraft carrier.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, which is useless against any power that has Silk War missiles. It's a huge target. But it looks cool. You can go to one of these aircraft carriers, get a tour.
Well, this is brings into question the whole Nuclear Security Council, which is the auspices for why the UN even exists. And recall that it is the Royal Society, the Cliveden set, the Milner Group that set up the League of Nations and United Nations under the auspices of policing the nuke threat. So Kim Jong-un, Castro and his nukes, right? You start to notice the pattern that these supposed nuke threats really service the globalists quite well, much in the same way that the rogue terrorist services the globalist, the Bin Laden, right?
Yeah, that's the interview I had a while back with the Collins brothers about the H2Ls, the bomb, the cult of the bomb, and proliferation. Right. How really the oligarchs, the Illuminati, if you will, actually want to promote. And there's evidence for this, by the way. That was revealed by one of the reasons why they thought what's her name, the Pakistani prime minister, was assassinated, because she revealed
Benazir Bhutto.
Yeah. Is that the CIA was actually promoting proliferation for the purpose of creating the fear of the nuke threat to legitimize collective security, whatever you want to call it. And that goes back, on their article.
This is the AQCon stuff.
The AQCon network, yeah.
Yeah.
And now, actually what happened was the CIA winked and nodded at it in support of the Afghan war in the 80s, but even they say that's probably just an excuse because, the bigger picture is the issue of the proliferation of the nuclear bomb, and how that was developed from the get-go, according to their article, was to create world government, the fear, because obviously the existence of such weapons would necessitate world government, and some of the spying scandals you had, particularly the Green Glass Network and the Rosenberg case. And
Rosenberg's, yep.
These were different factions within this group that thought that it was either Pax Americana or like a global system that was going to do this. And, there are people that wanted to immediately give the bomb to the Russians as opposed to good faith. And this was this leftist element. And there were the Pax Americana who thought the world could be brought under world government under American tutelage. There was the internationalists versus the nationalists, and these factions within this oligarchical, clique. But it's hard to say which one it was. But yeah, you're right. You're right. The suggestion of such a weapon is a pretext for world government.
Well, we know that. I mean, Quigley is explicit about that, and the really amusing part of this folly is who came up with that, and that is Bernard Baruch. Why is a banker coming up with the plot to erect the world government's, the UN Security Council on the basis of nukes? I've always found that interesting. Wouldn't it be someone, like a military strategist? Why is it a banker?
Yeah, because it creates a justification for this sinkhole we call the military budget, and all the chicanery and embezzlement that it involves. $9 trillion gone missing at the Pentagon.
Well, and I'm also more and more convinced that the 20th century that the Cold War was really the whole purpose of it was the erection of the infrastructure for the technocracy. I really think that was the purpose of it, because we were told for so long about all the spying and all the Russians. And I heard somebody else, by the way, the only person, it was my thesis, and then I heard Dave McGowan say it in one of his interviews, and I think he says in his Moon book. But all this NASA stuff and all that's all a front for the erection of all of this surveillance and the internet, basically. That's what all this is. Mm-hmm. And that's the predecessor, the stage before global government. And I just read Jacques Attali saying that the internet is really the predecessor to global government. And initially it will be the U.S. that is the engine of it. And Attali explicitly says that the costume of America will be shed and the real globalist will step forth. So anyway, but I'm just saying that the Cold War was the means by which this would happen. And that's actually proven, I think, in Miles Copeland's book.
Yeah, it's Miles Copeland, because move on to him. He's a functionary, but he kind of describes what, of course, the Anglo-American establishment lays it out. But then in his book, it's an example of someone who's a functionary who's actually carrying out their orders.
Yeah, on the ground, right.
On the ground. So that's an interesting. He's an interesting character. Of course, Miles Copeland. He's the father of Stuart Copeland, the drummer for the Police. Mm-hmm. Other brother, I think, is involved in record promotion. IRS Records, interesting name for the record company. Mm-hmm. Other company's called FBI, I think, is public relations outfit. Yep. But of course, Miles Copeland, his sons are in music, intelligence related. You mentioned Dave McGowan. Dave McGowan's Laurel Canyon book about the importance of music and the ties between the rock music scene of the '60s, particularly Laurel Canyon, to the intelligence military, because they provided the soundtrack from much of the turmoil of the '60s, which was created by these geopolitical events like the Vietnam War, which I think you probably agree with me, that was sort of a planned dialectic to achieve a lot of things. To sell a lot of helicopters, sell a lot of military hardware, pump in the heroin, and also a lot of social alchemy, right, to debase society. It's disrupt society through trauma, which is an old plan. But Miles Copeland, he's an interesting character.
Yeah, he's responsible, I guess, ultimately for the rise of Nasser in many ways. And ultimately, this would be back in 50s money, $500 billion, he says. Oh, excuse me, 500 million. In 50s money. And eventually, I guess, over time, into the 60s, it would go up into the billions. So what's neat is that the first few pages, this is a topic that you and I have touched on in the past, and you touched on it with Servando Gonzalez, is that Copeland says that mainline history is hidden from historians.
Yes.
And he says, and that's because mainline historians don't do intelligence analysis.
It's a great insight, yes.
Yeah. And Copeland says that, which is interesting. So right away in the preface, he says that. And then he goes on to say, which I thought was pretty wild, that the report from Iron Mountain, which is satire, he says that's a satire of what I was doing. He was part of this group called, at this time, they were called the Games Center. And he says that, yeah, it's satire, but they're satirizing what we really did at the Game Center.
Yeah, it's just the same. Dr. Strangelove is satire, but it's also true. Mm-hmm. So, Yeah, the report from Iron Mountain, which says that basically you have to promote war to promote social cohesion, because in the absence of war, what's there to hold society together?
Yes, and in fact, that will actually be stated explicitly in this book multiple times by Copeland, citing Bertrand Russell.
And it's also suggested in official U.S. government documents like NSC 68, which saw the wartime economy, the sort of military Keynesianism, was a way to promote perpetual prosperity, and also a way to promote social cohesion. There was this, so it's suggested.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, I think Leonard Lewin wrote the book, The Report from Iron Mountain. He's not pulling this out of his butt. Right. I mean, it's based on all satire is based on reality, which makes it satire. So there you go. So, it's,
right. The book, of course, is titled "The Amorality of Politics," and he's talking about global geopolitics, power politics. Mm-hmm. And it's amoral because in geopolitics, there's no good and bad. There's only winners and losers. So that's why game theory comes into this. And another fascinating thing is that we think of things like war games with Matthew Broderick in 1983 or 4 as being something predicting the future. According to Copeland, and this book was written in 1969, they were already using computer models to war game back then. So game theory was being used with computers in the 60s. So just because we didn't hear about it until Atari and the 80s, the Pentagon and the CIA had already been doing it for a couple decades.
David Rockefeller was tweeting in the 60s, right? There's no one out there to tweet.
Right.
He's tweeting Harriman, Pamela Harriman, and
well, it's funny. So if David it would be funny to do a sketch comedy thing, like where if David Rockefeller was going to be uploaded to the internet, what if you uploaded him to floppy disks, and he wanted to do that out of some kind of like reverence for the past or something. So you'd have like 7,000 floppy disks that would stored.
He's up there on the mothership somewhere.
Right. Yeah. So this book is confusing. You should read it. I think you would really find it fascinating because you don't really get a clear picture of, and maybe that's because they weren't sure exactly what they wanted to do with Nasser. You get the impression that it was kind of a wargaming scenario. Mm-hmm. And I think that what the thesis of the book is that that in some cases the CIA might want an apparently independent actor.
Yes, like a Castro.
Yes, yeah. Exactly, and that's why. Even Copeland says about midway through the book, yes, this is very confusing because we can't figure out exactly what the CIA's role to Nasser is. And maybe he was, prevented from exactly saying what the role was. But basically you get the impression that there was an older model of maybe we could try Arab nationalism or pan-Arabism. And he backs up the thesis of William Engdahl that they wanted a Muslim Billy Graham. So they thought, well, maybe Nasser could be that character. Maybe he could unite these warring Arabs. We'll give him a shot.
Yeah.
And so they had this period where they supported Arab nationalism. They fomented the coup in Syria in the 40s to bring General Zaim to power. That was, I guess, Copeland's first operation, the coup in 1949. It didn't go well. It didn't last. That coup fell apart pretty quick. And so they moved on to try different, more sophisticated techniques in Egypt with the character of Nasser. So they gave him a lot of money. They sent in all of these consultants from all these different marketing outfits. A lot of Madison Avenue would go in and tell Nasser what he needed to do. They gave him a giant business plan. I'm not joking. It's a business plan phases of what he could get done within, like a 5-year period.
And they were collecting probably huge fees too in the process.
Sure, Arthur Little Consulting. I think I can't remember if he mentions Walter Lippmann or not, but it's that kind of stuff.
Well, wasn't Copeland's cover a consultant?
Yes.
Yeah. So he was. Yeah. Because he officially left the agency like in the mid-50s or something. And so there you go.
Right, and one of the most telling sections is page 119 to 21, where he discusses the 5-year plan. So NASA had a 5-year plan. The consultants told him that it wouldn't work, and what they did was they actuaried Egypt out to the year 2000. And they had figured out that I'm not joking, in order to implement population control and birth control, it would take till about the year 2000. And the reason for that is that they would have to bring a period to where Egypt would be industrialized and experience a lot of economic growth and surplus, and then they could introduce the birth control and population control, but only after the economic success and excess.
Sounds like the United States.
Exactly. So this is a big admission, a big puzzle piece into figuring out that the long-term goals are really what matters. The long-term goals are actuaried out to where if a nation is experiencing a rise in economic surplus growth, industrialization, et cetera, that may not necessarily be for the good. But of course, most people are not going to figure that out. They're going to think, this is for our good. Our leaders love us. They are, industrializing us. They're bringing us factories to help us. No, actually, this is a preparatory stage for the next phase, to where the introduction of the abortuaries. This is the stuff that you and I have talked about so many times. That what's the real goal? Vaccines and abortions. And that's literally what Copeland admits here.
I remember back in the 94, the UN Population Conference was held in Cairo, Egypt. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Right. So why Cairo? Well, Suez Canal. Why Egypt? Egypt is the major Arab power. Egypt is a strategic location. Egypt has mineral, oil, etc.
Does he address the Suez crisis? The Suez in the 57 when the
yes, he does.
What does he say about that? How Eisenhower pulled the rug out from under Israel, Britain, and France. Okay.
Actually, he says, believe it or not, he says that it was not a big deal, and they didn't mind Nasser doing it. He says because it was done to make Nasser look good.
Yeah, that's why I always figured it was fishy. Yeah,
he said the CIA wasn't worried about it, and they weren't worried about the Soviet arms coming to Nasser either.
I mean, what's he going to do with them? I don't know. Oh no, he's got a MiG. He's got a few tanks.
That's what he said. He said, "What was he going to do?"
Yeah.
He said so. A lot of stuff was made a big deal of in the media that they didn't even care about.
And the tanks would probably be made by Ford and General Motors anyway.
Exactly right.
It's like they built the plants. I mean,
right. Another couple telling sections is the chapter on terrorism. Chapter 9 is just phenomenal in its admissions, Nasserism and terrorism. And he says that a lot of people were upset by the possibility of Nasser using terror. He says, it didn't bother us. He said, Americans don't like terrorism, but it plays an essential part in the West's own operations against recalcitrant Afro-Asian leaders, but we conceal this fact. Direct quote from Copeland on page 203. Now you're thinking, what? Now, not your audience, but the average guy is thinking, the West conceals its use of terrorism. What?
We're fighting ISIS. We're fighting Al-Qaeda.
Well, listen to what Miles Copeland says about the terrorists. Who's the terrorist? He says, well, look, the fanatic, he says, is a loser. He says fanatics are losers, but guess what? He says they're useful losers. They're very useful losers. Why is that, Miles? Well, fanatics sooner or later make a nuisance of themselves, and that the majority then clamps down on them, paying whatever price it takes. In the hands of non-fanatical leaders, however, fanatics are a weapon of flexibility and finesse. He's talking about terrorists.
Yeah, just there's this pragmatism again, right?
Yes, he says terrorists are beautifully expendable. Page 204.
Yeah,
another interesting.
It's why, Carlos the Jackal, Osama bin Laden.
Yes,
it's all the assets of.
Another interesting point is that the changes in Egypt were brought about through movies. He says that a lot of Egyptians would watch Hollywood movies, and they thought that that's how the average American lived. Like every American lives like James Bond or Rock Hudson or something. They live this fabulous lifestyle, and he says that this is partly what convinced them to shift out of the older Egyptian traditional, somewhat feudal society into the industrialized Egypt society.
Why can't Egyptians be more clever, more sophisticated like Americans who are immune to these things?
Well, what's funny is that in that section where he describes that perception, he says it is not unlike the idea that the average middle American has, that if he just pulls himself up by his bootstraps and commits to it, he can become the next Sam Walton.
Well, why can't any American sign a deal with David Rockefeller and the globalists?
Exactly right.
to work with Maoist China to bring in to provide low prices every day. That's fun. Yeah, but that's the myth. It's this the self-made man myth.
The self-made man, right?
I mean, obviously, in America, conditions are such if you are industrious and hardworking, you can usually provide a pretty good life for yourself. What you're saying is that this idea you become that there's we live in a meritocracy where
or that you can be the president if you're a good guy who worked hard or any of that kind of
crap
that I was told when I was in high school or public school.
Yeah, and we see these in movies like where a good man accidentally becomes president and he changes everything. It was a movie Dave where it was like the Prince and the Pauper.
I remember that.
Where all we need is a decent man in the White House. They'll just change everything.
Well, I like the he's what does he say? He says he likens it to becoming the CEO of General Motors. He says that this lie is very powerful. Mm-hmm. He says, and it gives rise to the idea that anyone possessing any modicum of intelligence can rise from a sharecropper's cabin to become the president of General Motors. He says it's just not true. And then he goes on to say, this is something that you and I have talked about, and I got this from I think it was Stephen Dorrell's MI6 book, but he repeats it, and he says that the CIA doesn't generally worry about coups because if they see it coming, he says that really all you have to do is make sure that if let's say you've got terrorists or a terrorist coup or something like that, he says just put the guy that you want in charge at the end.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter. If you know where the trend's going, just place your man in there ahead of time to at the right time, the key juncture. He says at the strategic moment, he can step in and consolidate the gains of the coup. So basically, this is just the tricks of the trade. Mm-hmm. Is what he's saying. And he ends this chapter, by the way, by saying, look, if you have a problem with terrorism, I hate to break it to you, but terrorism is just part of the game of nations, he says. Mm-hmm. And he says they were not worried about an Arab Union because if there was an Arab Union or a pan-Arabism, he says ultimately this would have fallen in line with the West.
Yeah, it would have become part of the Masonic West.
Yes. Yeah. And that is, by the way, he says, what is the goal of the Pax Americana? He says, liberty, democracy, the fraternity of man. So he literally does repeat the Masonic dictum.
Liberty, equality, and fraternity, yeah. So that's the slogan, for it all.
He says, but it's still kind of confusing. He says, NASA was used as a kind of games experiment where we would play him off in different scenarios in war games with the Soviets.
Was Nasser aware of this? Just
he says, and I'll quote what he says. He says that Nasser himself figured this out, and he says that there was an opening for a role, and that he was I'm not joking. Quote, he was the right actor for the role at the right time. Miles Copeland says, that's exactly why we like Nasser, is that he understood that.
Well, all the world is a stage.
Yes, I think Copeland says something to that effect too. He says that another reason why they didn't mind all of this is chapter 12, they didn't mind all of his Soviet talking points, was that he was a big, how does he put it? Nasser was perfect for the big pipeline companies. He basically says, as long as Tapline, Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, and Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California, as long as they were getting their pipelines, it didn't really matter. Is kind of what he says.
It's like when Castro sent 100,000 Cuban troops to Angola, and they're there guarding Chevron's oil fields.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So when you get to the end, this is after the Arab-Israeli War chapter. Copeland basically says, you can have whatever ideology you want. We don't care. He says you can be anti-imperial and anti-American. He says just so long as you're on board with bringing down your population. That's what he says.
Yeah, once again, these ideologies don't matter. Because it's like voting.
Exactly.
Like voting. It doesn't change anything.
Well, it's interesting that the one ideology he says it does matter is depopulation.
Yeah. And
then, by the way, another interesting point I think that should be made is Miles gives you a big reading list, recommended reading. Well, not big, maybe 20 books. That's very instructive. Guess who makes that list? Our good friend Bertrand Russell makes that list. And CFR books, publications make that list. The RAND Corporation makes that list. Herman Kahn, Technocracy.
RAND Corporation.
And books on ecology. So that's who Miles tells you to read if you want to understand the world. The book, by the way, is written for guys who are going to be CIA operatives and for corporate people. The book, he says in the preface, he says, if you're going to find benefit in this, if you are working for a corporation and you want to understand the Middle Eastern mindset and how it works. So this is corporate people. This is corporate government, corporatocracy here.
Yeah, weaponized anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding the conquered people, the people you've colonized, and how to exploit them, and that's what Ed Lansdale was doing in the Philippines. Gregory Bateson, the stuff that he collected during the Second World War, but this developed. Of course, one thing we're talking about the third world under lesser developed nations and these things.
Right.
The same things applied here at home.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that you'll notice that the experiments, the tests, the game theories that were done with Nasserism, ultimately, they were studied. So these are experiments that you can, I think it is accurate to paint it that way. And the experiments are done for the purpose of controlling the target population. Mm-hmm. So just like we've talked about with Phoenix program, Copeland is essentially saying, he's not going to say in the book, this is all to destroy America. But he's going to say that, this is for the better maintenance of the Western world and the global democracy and all this stuff, which is essentially the same thing. Another flowery way of saying the same thing. And this is really, Karibko kind of came to the same conclusion, that the operations, the covert black operations and the regime changes and the coups and all this stuff that's been done all over is ultimately to synthesize the information to have one overriding game plan for the management of the human population.
Yeah. And that's you get that through entertainment, sports. You get that through controversy. That the left-right dialectic or paradigm we're given these things to absorb our attention, to excite our passions, to misdirect us, which is most important, to distract us.
Yeah, I mean, this is what Copeland says about why he liked Nasser so much, is that rather than understanding Nasser as a president or some sort of like a figure who's really interested in nationalism, Nasser is a CEO, is a better way to understand it. Mm-hmm. And if the CIA doesn't ultimately like where Nasser goes with things, they'll fire him, i.e., a coup or something to that effect. But yes, so the business phase model, I think, is accurate, and it's better to understand these figures as corporate heads.
And that's how the world is run.
Yes.
And that's how, even here at our state, our fixed elections, our controlled media, not just the news, but the entertainment, the movies, everything, the manipulation of the cultural perception management, which is done through the control of the media, which, going back to the Anglo-American establishment, how he spells out how that's done. Mm-hmm. Through revolving doors and, rings within rings, and, these things, through the newspapers, through the governmental agencies, even the universities. The universities are part of this complex.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's what Copeland says about the report from Iron Mountain is that he said I left the War Games Center, and this is people like at Rand and people from Rand. He mentions Herman Kahn. He says when I was not at the central hub of planning, I guess when he's out doing his quote consulting, he says the report from Iron Mountain satirized this. He says, but it basically just continued in the universities.
Yeah,
he says.
And also the destabilization, because I do think a lot of the riots that were witnessed here in this country back in the '60s, we've had revelations regarding MK Ultra and the connection to Vacaville Prison and the Symbionese Liberation Army being an intelligence operation. A lot of these stories, even Black Power was supported by the Ford Foundation. Black Panthers were radicalized by agent provocateurs. These things are all part of this an alchemical program to fundamentally change society, to disrupt it, make it fearful, to exploit the politics of it. Politicians did this. Nixon did this. Every politician exploited it. But above them, they were looking to fundamentally change American society. And
yes,
they have succeeded. And this is because you I think was it this? You also mentioned the changing images of man. This thing out of SRI.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a perfect example of the coalescing of this kind of research. Mm-hmm. I mean, changing images of man is not based on Miles Copeland's regime change.
No.
It's basically a kind of ethnography or anthropology.
It's definitely weaponized anthropology.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the idea of altering man's view of himself, which, by the way, is what all of the other globalist characters that I will be doing in this series discuss. Wells discusses it. Bertrand Russell says that the great thing about Darwin is that Darwin was the nail in the coffin of man's dignity.
That's right.
So, I mean, this is just these people are just so sick. But
we're just a naked ape, as the book.
Yeah, right. And the only reason, really, ultimately, that Newton and Copernicus and Galileo and these figures are praised by Russell is that they had the effect of removing man from his pedestal and placing him as one meaningless dot within an infinite universe, right? Which the universe was not previously viewed as infinite. Now, of course, man is just a sort of a meaningless emergent creation of the meaningless emergent universe, which has no purpose or meaning. And again, yeah, all those figures were instrumental in that ideology. But again, this is a crafted and marketed ideology. I mean, these characters like H.G. Wells, and even to a large degree, I'm convinced Bertrand Russell. I mean, yes, he was a philosopher and a logician and a mathematician, but he's much more of a propagandist than we might think. And when you're reading Wells, you read The Open Conspiracy. He ends the book by he talks all this stuff about how to subvert and infiltrate and bring about the world government. And then he ends it by saying, look, why are we doing this? Because you're going to get Star Trek. I promise you, you'll get Star Trek out of all this. Just let us do what we want to do. Come along with us. It's going to be fun. You're going to get a phaser. You're going to be James Kirk.
Yeah. The girls were wearing miniskirts.
Yeah. At the same time, however, he does say that, yeah, most of you are going to die. So you're probably not going to be James Kirk. But down the road, we'll have James Kirk. So isn't it noble to die for the world government? That's literally what he said. So you start to realize these guys are just propagandists. They're just selling this grand mythology of materialism and progress and,
It's interesting on Star
Space
Trek.
Babes, right?
Yeah, interesting on Star Trek. They never mention what the world's Earth's population is in the 23rd century.
Right.
Is it 500 million? No.
The Georgia sounds right.
The reason all the girls are so hot is they followed that Dr. Strangelove plan to bring all the hot girls into the mine shafts.
The underground bases, yeah.
The women have to be extremely attractive to stimulate repopulation. At that point, the Russian ambassador goes, I have to admit, Dr. Strangelove, I find your plan particularly interesting.
Right.
Of course, government leaders are included in this to provide leadership.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's now all this is insane, of course, and it just leads to slaughter and death and genocide and a dystopic future. But there's a reaction to this, of course, and you did a recent talk regarding critique of this Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, who apparently has the ear of Vladimir Putin. Now, there's some criticism of this because does Dugin represent a sincere opposition to the Anglosphere, this Masonic Anglo-American empire? Because obviously the answer to Russophobia isn't Russophilia. There's room for criticism here, and you don't have to take one side or the other. But nevertheless, your take on Dugin was interesting because Dugin, his fourth way, seems to be offering some sort of solution, but you also find problems with it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and I got a lot of criticism merely because, well, not a lot, but just a couple people who found cause to make the interview the accusation that I'm a Russian agent, which is funny because Dugin's been on many shows, even been on Alex Jones several times. So I don't think that proves that a person is a Russian agent. That's kind of a ridiculous argument. I got the interview because I simply sent an email and said, would you like to do an interview? So it wasn't that difficult. It's no more difficult than you interviewing Servando Gonzalez or anyone else.
Yeah.
Now, I think he's an interesting thinker, and on one level he's interesting because there's a lot more depth there than you would get in somebody like Brzezinski. One of the things about pragmatism and the Western pragmatic approach is that it discards everything with any philosophical depth just simply for the pragmatic. And that becomes very boring and technical. And so when you read Brzezinski, I mean, it's just really boring. And there's no hope, there's no answer, nothing but the vague platitudes of democracy and freedom and so-called technocracy that's going to, let us upload our souls to the internet or something.
And when you're reading Brzezinski, you're hearing his voice.
Which is sort of ominous, and that which I think you were saying that he kind of exaggerated that affectation or something.
Yeah, it's like a role he was playing, yeah.
Yeah.
Intimidating.
So what you have with Dugin is a person who kind of has a spotty background in terms of different movements, different attempts at trying to coalesce with National Bolshevism, trying to start a Eurasian movement to counteract the West. And I didn't really put a lot of stock in any of that. I wouldn't call myself a Eurasian. I don't think that is a real reaction per se. But I am interested in interacting with his philosophy and his ideas. So the first thing that I found positive was I thought his critique of the liberal tradition in the West is 100% accurate. That does not mean that I adopt all of his solutions, but I think his critique is spot on because he's accurate in saying that the end result of radical individualism is transhumanism, because once you divide from any sort of metaphysical grouping that's outside of the individual, the logical conclusion is that family and gender also become constrictions or infringements upon your liberty, quote unquote. And I think that that's absolutely true. I've argued that for a long time, way before I'd ever heard of Dugin.
The physical world presents limitations, but there are such things as healthy limitations, like respecting the law of gravity.
Right. And so Dugin is correct when he sees and argues that transhumanism is the logical result of Western liberalism. And when he says Western liberalism, he means the traditional Anglo-American pragmatic tradition. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about Adam Smith, John Locke, Jefferson, Franklin, all of those characters lumped under the Enlightenment and so forth. So Dugin is very anti-Enlightenment. I think that so what is the fourth political theory? Well, the idea is that because of the first, when he lists the three, he's talking about communism, fascism, and liberal democracy. And he says these three are the ideologies of the 20th century. Two of them have died. There is no more Marxism, and there is no more fascism. Those are dead ideologies. They're not going to be resurrected. The only thing that has lasted that won was Western democratic liberalism. That did win the 20th century. It defeated the Soviet Union. It defeated all of its rivals, communism and fascism. So now we're at this stage, he says, where we are post-ideology and we're into the postmodern period. He believes that is the logical result of Western liberalism. I would agree with him there. That's why techno-dominance, techno-nihilism is kind of the phase that you go to after democracy. Democracy is inherently self-destructive, essentially. So he sees it as something that just completely and continually divides and divides and divides and divides until even the individual is conceived of as having to divide himself and reappropriate himself into some technological form. So in other words, bodily modification through technology, implants, bionic arms, et cetera, et cetera. This is where we're going because of the logic of the system that we've adopted in terms of postmodern techno-nihilism. And he's absolutely right there. He cites the figures like I've cited many times, Jean Baudrillard, different philosophers who predicted this. And so anyway, Dugin finds then influence from characters like Carl Schmitt, from characters like Martin Heidegger. And so I think in many ways you could argue that Dugin is somewhat Platonic in his perspectives. He does believe that there are real metaphysical categories that bind us. But what's interesting and where I would take issue with Dugin when I see him not being consistent is that he also believes that he seems to accept the cultural relativism of Claude Lévi-Strauss. And he does this, I presume, I haven't read all of his books. I've read a couple of them, but he's got several. And I'm working with the modern writings of Dugin. Dugin has older writings that are very Gnostic. So I don't know if he still adheres to those. He seems to adhere to some of the Gnostic ideas, which I do not agree with. But he seems to think that the cultural relativism of someone like a Claude Lévi-Strauss could be argued against the West to justify the non-intervention perspective, which would allow other cultures to develop in a multipolar sense, if that makes sense.
I see. Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So what he tries to do, I think, and maybe I misunderstand him, is that when he argues, for example, with that guy that he got into it with in the BBC interview, he says to the BBC dude, "Hey, you believe in relativism. Why is it, if you believe that you have your truth and I have my truth, that your truth then has to be imposed on all the other cultures?"
Yeah.
Which is a valid criticism. But I think that the problem is that approach presumes that the cultural relativists are going to be coherent, and they're not. You're not going to get a logical stance from these characters because they're not logical. They're irrational. And so the whole point of relativism is to destroy. It's not to just get along, man, and you have your culture and I'll have my culture. I don't think that works.
Yeah, I think they're being used as shock troops, more or less, by the oligarchs.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, the relativism. It's like those who talk about tolerance. I will not tolerate intolerance. You know. Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I mean, Dugin, I think, is sophisticated enough to realize that, but I don't know whether he actually believes that is a real philosophically defensible position, or whether he sees it as a tactic to try to say, why don't you just let us be? Why don't we have, if you're a relativist, let there be a multipolar world? That's not going to happen.
Yeah, he's trying to embarrass them, and you can't embarrass these people.
Exactly. They don't have any shame. So that's the main problem that I see with Dugin, and I would level a further critique that if that's his position, as I understand him, then when he argues that the West is imperialist and that it tries to impose by force its ideology on the rest of the world, if you come back at that with cultural relativism, if cultural relativism is true, then your argument for cultural relativism is also culturally relative. Mm-hmm. See, so it also has no force. So you also can't make a universal critique of another position, I would say. And I just see that as inconsistent. And I think that the perspective that Dugin is coming from, it tends to be influenced by other thinkers in the New Right or the European Right, Alain de Benoist, however you say it. Other figures who've written on the New Right. Many of them have a sort of neo-pagan perspective, mm-hmm. Neo-Gnostic, neo-pagan view on attempts at trying to combat globalism. And I don't think that those ultimately would be successful. So finally, the last chapter of Dugin's book, I think, is problematic, where he seems to have this kind of Gnostic view of chaos. He seems to say that logos, or societies, or organized, well, every society has its own kind of logos or rational principle that organizes it. But he says that there's some kind of real metaphysical principle to chaos that can be useful. So to me, that sounds a little bit sort of Kabbalistic or Gnostic, and that I would disagree with. But I think that Dugin should be commended in some respects for being a geopolitical thinker who, for example, is very critical of Darwinism. I don't know any other geopolitical writers that actually, will write a whole chapter critiquing Darwinism. So I will give him credit for that.
The discipline of geopolitics itself, isn't that just dominated by knee-jerk interventionists and imperialists? Because the whole study of it is kind of to justify, power politics and these things, geopolitical, jockeying in these things. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. And it's obviously the Darwinian approach would be, they'd find it advantageous because it's survival of the fittest, right? That's,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting he takes a criticism of the Darwinian theory because he's offering. I mean, I take it he's arguing from a defensive standpoint. Leave us alone. Stop intervening in our affairs, that sort of thing, and let us sort out our own problems.
Well, yes, and he thinks that he thinks that modernity leads to postmodernity, and postmodernity will actually be the death of all cultures. Mm-hmm. And so he seems to say that he would like a broad coalition of anyone who's anti-liberal, and by that he means anti-individual, Western, pragmatic, globo capitalism.
It's a similar approach. Yeah, it's a similar approach that E. Michael Jones has taken when he's talking to the Iranians about the Great Satan. And he agrees with him.
Yeah, I mean, Dugin would be for being pro-Iran as opposed to anything pro-Western. Absolutely, I think you're right there.
Yeah,
I just don't think that you're going to ever find a coherent coalition amongst some kind of cultural relativism or through some kind of weird Gnosticism. I mean, ultimately, he's also influenced by figures like René Guénon and Fritjof Schuon, the traditionalists or the perennialists. And the problem with traditionalism and perennialism is that it very quickly devolves also into just relativism and Gnosticism. Mm-hmm. And these are ultimately ineffective. So I think that Dugin is trying to borrow maybe from too many wells. He wants to have ideology borrowed from Gnostic writers, ideology borrowed from Bolsheviks, ideology borrowed from perennialists and aristocrats, Julius Evola, fascists, ideologies borrowed. I mean, there's just, and at the same time, borrow ideas from Byzantium and Orthodox writers. So I don't think that all of these it turns into a big mush pile.
It's ecumenism, which is...
Well, Dugin would be anti-ecumenical. He would see the ecumenical movement as a Western Rockefeller ecumenical project to destroy other cultures and religions. And he's right about that. But what I'm saying is that his solution, in my view, is still too syncretistic to really work, I would say.
Well, would reviving Russian traditionalism and orthodoxy, wouldn't that be sufficient to create a bulwark against the Masonic, West, the CIA, these things? And
Dugin would say that he would have no problem. I'm saying what he would claim. He would claim to have no problem with America having its classical classical non-interventionist tradition. So Dugin would be fine with Jefferson and Franklin and the Bill of Rights and all this stuff, as long as America wants that for America. But when America tries to export that to the Middle East and to Russia or wherever else, that's what he would have a problem with. And he's trying to say that on the basis of cultural relativism. You have that for you, that's fine. If that's your Western Anglo tradition, you have your Western Anglo. But see, this is one of the problems with all of the traditionalists. And this would be Guénon, this would be Coomaraswamy, this would be Evola. They, on the one hand, want to have this cultural relativism where they can maintain their traditions, but at the same time, you can't have that within itself presupposes some universal truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
in other words, everybody has to submit to the belief that we all have a right to maintain our cultures and our traditions.
Yeah, that's a universal claim. Yeah.
That is a universal claim, right? But the positions are all still predicated on cultural relativism, and therefore I think that this is problematic. So in other words, you have to have some kind of universalism. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you read, and I like a lot of these, I think they will have if you read Evola, he has a great critique of modernity. But that doesn't mean that Evola's Gnosticism and fascism are the solution. I don't think they are. It's the same with Guénon or any of these characters. If you read Spengler is a very insightful writer about history. He approaches history like nobody else from that very high German philosophic perspective. But Spengler is a cultural relativist. He says something to the effect of in Decline of the West that you can't understand geometry the way the Greeks did because you're not a Greek. And I think that this is just ultimately just doesn't work. I mean, the numbers that we use are the same abstract principles, right? That
Yeah.
that the Greeks used. So there's an attempt to oppose Western universalism that tries to step back into some form of regionalism or provincialism or localism or traditionalism, quote unquote, that doesn't work, I don't think. And it's also not consistent with Orthodox Christianity. I mean, Dugin says he's Orthodox, then you can't believe that there's some sort of metaphysical principle called chaos that's like equal to logos. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Now, of course, as Americans, we are forced to kind of reevaluate what the role America is as in history and why it was created in the first place. It's difficult to, we're brought up to revere people like Washington and Jefferson and these people.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, in the final analysis, or at least a deep analysis, is it looks like America was created to be sort of this revolutionary force, this force of instability. Same with sort of a Whig foreign policy. The Whig policy was conservatism at home and radicalism abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we're in the year 2017, and that's the 300th anniversary of the opening of the lodge in England.
Yeah,
it's British Freemasonry.
Well, and Dugin would definitely be opposed to that. He would, I think, say, this ideology is at once universal and destructive to. By the way, this is another interesting point that he makes, is that he says that this is also destructive to ethnicities. Mm-hmm. He says that the Western ethos of what it's become is resulting in ethnocide, and that cultures are self-destructing. So it's unique because it's not a traditional form of warfare where it's one culture just wiping out the other one. It's an ideological virus, and he quotes the Stephen Mann guy from the Pentagon saying that the ideology of American democracy, quite literally, this is a direct quote, is a virus to destroy all other cultures.
Yeah, and we have what the term creative destruction is used by.
Yeah.
Who was it? What's his name? That neocon. I forget his name.
Well, this is it Stephen Mann? I mean, that's
no, it's not Stephen Mann. It's he's a neocon. With his name. If you said his name, I'd get it. But yeah, the term well, actually that comes from Schumpeter. He applied it economically, but they apply it geopolitically. To going in and destroying a country, and I guess getting the contracts to rebuild it. They call it creative destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Ledeen, I think Michael Ledeen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That concept. But it's because what we're getting at here is a project that's centuries in the making, and as mere mortals who live 70, 80 years and have to live day to day and work and take care of our affairs, it's how does one contemplate, understand these things?
Right.
Like when I'm getting at America's land of the free, home of the brave. It was a revolution. It broke away from the British Empire. Yet, in the final analysis, it seems to be an adjunct to the British Empire.
Yes, that was what the CFR and the Milner Group planned to do. And so I think that it could be appreciated in Dugin that he agrees and says the same thing as the sort of Heartland, Rimland, Mackinder theory, but he claims to be from the opposite perspective that yes, that division of the world into these kind of regions might be accurate, but that the land power has this is why he likes Carl Schmitt and the idea of nomos, the law of the land and so forth, that the land power tends towards metaphysical stability in the worldview, and the sea power, because of its focus on mercantilism and monetarism, is by its very nature tends towards sodomy and usury and trade. So Mammon, it worships Mammon. I don't think anybody can deny that the city of London is organized around global Mammon. That's its god. So I think he's accurate in all those analyses. I just don't agree with his solutions ultimately. But he's also useful for a good analysis of contemporary Russian politics. If you read his book, which I've not completed it, I'm a good ways into it now, Putin versus Putin, and his other book, Last War of the World Island, The Contemporary Geopolitics of Russia. He's got very enlightening chapters on the fifth column of the CFR globalist influence in Russia. And I think that that's a very insightful window into understanding who the characters are, the Carnegie endowment in Russia, the CFR publications in Russia, the different characters in Russia who, through the Fortune 100 and through different entities, do have a very powerful influence in Russia, unfortunately. And then Dugin seems to argue that Putin is a figure who would like to see Russian nationalism continue, and that he would not. Dugin argues that he has actively taken steps against the oligarchs, which I'm sure most people are familiar with the idea of the Russian oligarchs. I'm sure deals were struck. I'm not saying that this is all good guy, bad guy, but that he doesn't completely want the destruction of his country, and I think that the oligarchs do want that.
Which would distinguish him from like Angela Merkel or Macron in France or something.
Right, but Dugin's book is also a critique because he says that ultimately he finds support for Putin justifiable, but that Putin has not, been consistent.
As you'd expect from a politician.
Good point. Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of Russia being infiltrated, from after the 90s and the takedown of Russia, the raping of Russia, but even before then, David Rockefeller had landing rights in Moscow in the height of the Cold War. And the Bolsheviks themselves could be seen as a sort of a bacilli injected into Russia to destabilize and weaken it. And Putin is an interesting character because he grew up under that system. He was KGB, these things, and he was. So how does one, like anything, he's growing up within that system. He has to survive within that system, and that system is going to shape him. It's going to form his development. But nevertheless, you've seen this resurgence of sort of traditional Russia after the end of the Cold War, something that was, I think, the West tried to destroy,
right?
With their man Yeltsin.
Well, here's an interesting thing I've noticed too. One of the themes that we've talked about throughout this interview and in other interviews as well is the idea of a radical movement that wipes out the previous culture. And as John Adams always makes the point to say in his talks, that's not necessarily a statement of the previous structure being angelic. It's just a statement of moving things in a new direction. And so what we've learned from the Yale support, the Skull and Bone support, the OSS support of Mao was that Mao's cultural revolution had the effect of destroying traditional Chinese culture. It's not a statement of affirmation for a Chinese emperor. No. It's just a statement of destroying that culture. Bolsheviks, exact same thing, right? Destroying that culture. What we see with the Frankfurt School and these characters and what they're doing with the social justice warriors now in America is the same thing. And you're seeing that exportation of that so-called liberalism to the Ukraine and to Russia, right? When you look at Pussy Riot, when you look at the extension of all the gay rights and all this kind of stuff, it's the same thing. It's the same model of trying to wipe out what's there before, which is exactly what Miles Copeland said, to wipe out.
This is the NGO complex that Patrick Henderson has written so much about.
Sure, to wipe out anything, but what the NGO complex has to use is total degeneracy and just aesthetic terrorism. Yes. Some have put it.
And the language of human rights, of course. Equality, fraternity, they use that language, and you get this degenerate behavior being promoted in Russia, in Hungary,
Yes.
In these things. There's a huge protest. Was it in Ireland? Today, I saw this headline about their restrictive abortion laws. They've been liberalized lately, but now they're again. This is what's happening. Is Ireland has been updated. They bring in the degenerate Western culture, destroy.
Right.
Of course, the destruction of the Catholic Church in Ireland, I think, was part of that. The scandal,
absolutely,
the infiltration of the church, the scandalization of the church through these sex scandals. They had to weaken the church first before they do to weaken, to penetrate Irish society. And
yes,
that's another example of a country being relatively poor but pleasant. They got rich, and now they're falling apart.
Yeah, and it was a few years ago that the IMF was,
yes.
talking to Russia or to Ireland and saying that they would have to restructure.
Yeah,
all this garbage.
Yeah. And there's an example of Iceland where they just told everyone to take a hike, and their economy has recovered because they realized the bankers' debt wasn't the people's debt. Imagine that.
Yeah, and who was I reading that was talking about austerity? I can't remember, but yeah, this is where the austerity comes in. As you see, it was in the Tavistock book that they'll alternate the phases back and forth. Well, we talked about it. They'll go from a period of prosperity. Oh, you produced him, you overproduced. Time for austerity. Yeah. So it's kind of back and forth game that's played, but I think
it's also part of the psychological warfare too. Yeah.
Right.
Financial warfare. Finance is warfare. I mean, it's
yes.
The way it's obviously the way the banks and these crises are created, fomented, the pump and dump scheming that occurs, and the whole scam of health insurance and Wall Street and 401ks and these things. It's like my wife just took a part-time job and they had a mandatory. She used to give like 5% to her retirement. Beloved Wall Street loves that. It's a tax to pump in money into Wall Street because it goes. It's like what if she doesn't want to? But it's of course it's tax deferred too. That's another thing. The same thing they did with everyone's talking about indebtedness of cities and municipal bonds. Mm-hmm. Well, the one reason why these cities are able to market these municipal bonds and drive up the debt for so long is because they're exempt from federal income tax. So yeah, if you and really it's the rich people that buy the bonds, and you've money, you can buy a bunch of bonds and you're going to get that 2-3% tax free. It's worth a lot to you. But what this does is this subsidizes municipal corruption because the governments are horribly corrupt and inefficient and bloated payrolls and these things, and eventually it goes bankrupt, and then they get lay off a bunch of workers, and then the infrastructure fall apart. Like the water system up in what was that town? Up in Wisconsin, where they have the lead in the water. They can't even maintain the infrastructure anymore. At the same time, you're spending, $10 million on missile and firing into Syria for no particular reason,
Yeah. Well, I think the point is ultimately that there is a unified agenda, and that the last thing I'll say on Dugin is that I think he's right to try to look at the root of the ideology that is so destructive, and the root of the ideology is the end result or the presuppositions of liberalism, which is all the many things that we talk about, naturalistic materialism, the idea that the individual is the measure of all things, the idea of generic ideas of progress, the assumptions of evolution, et cetera, all these things that are unfortunately now embedded in Western thought, which I mean, it's not really that this is necessarily characteristic of the West because it's the West. I mean, these are just terminologies that are used to describe locales. I mean, conceivably, America could be a land power, right? I mean, that's
right.
Largely land, right?
But it's called a sea power from the standpoint of geopolitics, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
part of the problem, I would say, with the American ethos is that within its presupposition, or within the idea of what it is to be American, you have a fundamental contradiction between, on the one hand, claims of universal principles, rights, these kinds of things, and at the same time, contradictory claims about what it is to be a nation, what it is to be a people, that can be based around rational propositions when that's never been tried in the history of the world before.
That's right. It's not you're not dealing with a region, a land, an ethnicity. It's a proposition nation. That's right. Yeah. Inherently unstable.
And so you're going to have, within that two paths that this could take based on those two contradictory premises. And what we've seen in the history of America is it going the wrong way, unfortunately, towards the idea of, eventually what the CFR wants and what the globalists want. And then that's where we are now. And so, I think that we do need some kind of unifying ideology that transcends, obviously, nationhood, that transcends provincialism and localism to combat globalism, precisely because globalism is international. Yeah. But the only possible ways to combat that are not going to be through economic philosophies of libertarianism or any of that kind of stuff. It's only going to be, I believe, philosophical, theological worldview. And that's going to have to be solved through some kind of religious view. And that's the perspective I take. And so that's where I would disagree with Dugin. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting within America. You see that tension played out because if you look at, you mentioned America as a sea power, the power of the globalists are all basically based along the Eastern Seaboard elite. Mm-hmm. And that ideology that comes from being a sea power, the seaboard elite, the trade and finance that comes from it. However, you do see that within American history is the Midwest being anti-interventionist. This is the American First Committee, the isolationists, the areas that were skeptical of the Eastern Seaboard's alliance with the British Empire and how that had to be smashed. And within America, we see that tension. You can see the conservatism of the Midwest land power versus the radicalism of the Eastern Seaboard elite, which is the sea power. And this is why
it's the same. Same tension. That's a good point.
And that section of the country had to be smashed through wars, World War I, World War II, interstate highway system, the destruction of the ethnic neighborhoods, and these things, and also ultimately, I would say the deindustrialization of those areas and the immiseration of those areas.
Yeah, which can also be seen as reflected in the idea of the country versus the city. Yeah. Cosmopolitan cities are havens of degeneracy and everything. There's evils in the countryside, but you need look no further than what did Charles Galton Darwin say in The Next Million Years? He says that cities are social engineering for not. I don't think that a city has to be, but he's saying that the modern industrial cosmopolitan city, Brzezinski says this, is social engineering to lure you in through the promise of mammon and money and job and off of the countryside, get to the city where everything's exciting. Mm-hmm. And then you lose your identity where you came from, and you're used up and you're spit out. And the last place I would ever want to be is somewhere like New York. I visited New York for a week one time. I would never go back there. Yeah. I went to Washington a few years ago, D.C. I thought it was awful. It was just this giant multicultural hellhole. It's like Blade Runner, where he's walking around and it's all just like this giant globalist mess. What is this is, I guess, a little known secret. What does Charles Galton Darwin say? What have all the British aristocrats all known too, by the way? You have your country house. Yes. He says that we will remain wild men and we will not be tamed by the cosmopolitan cities. Literally, that's what he says. He says because they're social engineering. And you even see this reflected in Downton Abbey too, because The aristocrats in the show, they'll visit the city for a few weeks, maybe a month during the summer, but they will not live there. If you lived in the city, you're kind of like, you were looked down upon as kind of a fool. Because who went to the city? The only person who would go to the city is somebody who's out for money or out for vice. I mean, why else would you go to the city unless you're going to shop or something? The aristocratic attitude, ironically, was correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, anything else, Jay? I think we cover it. You think?
I think that covers it. For those who are interested, I'm going to be dealing in the next several weeks with, as we said, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells books, Jonas Salk books.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to deal with John C. Lilly. We're going to deal with Charles Galton Darwin, Jacques Attali. So we're going to go one by one through the globalist books and see what they say.
Jonas Salk, a pioneer in vaccinations who promoted, who was an advocate of depopulation.
Yeah. The hero who saved lives also wants to kill everybody.
What's your takeaway from that? Yeah.
Well, I've read a couple chapters in the two kind of short books that I got. First of all, I would say that would make me immediately suspicious of vaccines, since he's quite literally considered the father of inoculations. And I have here in my hand his book, The Survival of the Wisest. Wow. Okay.
That would be him, I think.
That would be him and his evolutionary cronies who literally worship evolution as a religion. And he says, in the first chapter, he says, what is the number one problem that we've got to deal with? Can you guess what it is?
Overpopulation.
Exactly. And then he says, what have we got to do to fix this? Change man's view of man. Just like changing
images of man. Yep. Yeah. And wasn't it Bertrand Russell who said, was it him who said through injunctions and injections?
Yes. I've got it here in front of me too. That's well, actually, so in both Impact of Science on Society and in the Scientific Outlook, he repeats himself, and he says that in the future, the global government. This is chapter 14. He says that any sort of, where is that? Okay, here it is. Sterilization of the feeble-minded is not yet practical politics, but it will become so within the next 50 years. As we have already seen, it may be superseded when embryology is far more advanced and direct methods of operating on the fetus are available. And then in the next page he says, the model, I'm not joking, the model of the technocrat of the future, he says, is Lenin.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. He says Lenin was the model technocrat.
Yeah, he was such a softie.
Wasn't he?
Ultimately,
yeah, so I mean, there's going to be a whole bunch in this. I've read about half the book so far, but I've skipped around different chapters. But yeah, we're going to dive into that. Yeah, I mean, the chapters in the book are about, quote, scientific government, scientific technique, the scientific control of reproduction. That's the last chapter. So, or excuse me, second to last chapter. Last chapter is scientific values.
The scientific control of reproduction. Because that goes to sterilization.
Yes.
You know, obviously through toxic environment, toxic foods and these things, and, you know, they can lower. No, you talked about the collapse of the sperm count and these things and how.
Yes.
Or just simply making a situation where women hold off having babies until they're in their mid to late 30s.
Right.
You know, that's all of a sudden you need the expert to come in, right? Because the old way doesn't work. Yeah.
There's actually, whoever wrote this introduction to Scientific Outlook, I bought a newer copy because I was interested to see what kind of introduction they would write. And the guy that wrote the introduction says, he's some philosopher who's a materialist, and he says, it's pretty amazing that Brave New World was written 2 years after this book, and Brave New World is everything that's in scientific outlook.
That's amazing.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, he also mentions, he says, if you were to read 2 books other than Bertrand Russell's book, he says that would, well, he mentions 3 books. He says the 3 books to read that would encapsulate what Russell's getting at is James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution.
Yeah.
And he was a CIA guy who Miles Copeland says to read. That's one of the recommended reading by Miles Copeland.
That's right. He's one that there's 3 rules of ruling or something that he quotes from James Burnham. Yeah.
Yep. And then he goes on to say, read Brave New World in 1984.
Yeah.
So
pick your poison. Which one is going to be?
Right.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Jay. I look forward to those, to listen to those critiques. Of course, Jay's Analysis. Go to jaysanalysis.com. $4.95 a month, $60 a year. You get a membership. You can get the full lectures, which are definitely worth it. And of course, one benefit is if you are a subscriber to Jay's Analysis, you do get occasionally get to watch one of his shows, Hollywood Decoded. He posts those for a few days.
Yeah, I'm only able to post the links that are time sensitive.
Yeah.
But I hope to continue to be able to do that as long as I can. But I don't know if I'll be able to do all 23. But but yeah, you can watch those, and if you would, order the book directly from me and not Amazon, because I don't make anything on Amazon. But
Esoteric Hollywood: Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. It's sold so well. It's now in paperback, right?
It was always paperback. However, I will say that we are now. It's translated into Romanian, and it's about to be translated into German.
Cool.
Yeah.
You should get a hold of a Romanian copy. It'd be just interesting to see.
Well, the cover of the Romanian copy is really neat. I kind of wish it was the cover of mine. They did a better cover for the Romanian one, but yeah, I'm looking forward to the German copy too.
Cool. Okay. So that's Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. Hollywood Decoded. You can also watch each episode by subscribing to the Gaia Network. Yeah. So, okay. Well, listen. Great, Jay. Thanks a lot. I'll let you go.
All right.
And we'll talk again in the near future. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll probably post this probably early next week. When I do, I will send you the link. So.
Okay. Cool.
Great. Good night then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.